Good morning and welcome back. It's a Monday morning, so we're starting a new week. And in fact, it's our 9th week on the final part of our course, Step by Step. And it's step by step to the coming King. So we're going through the Old Testament. Not every chapter, not every story. That would take us years, really, to do that. But rather looking at some of the big highlights of the Old Testament story that prepare the way, that point the way forward to the coming king. And of course, in recent days, we've been looking at kings, Saul, David, and today Solomon. And there'll be more kings to come. So this is unusually helpful and resonant, because Jesus is the King of Kings and he's the Lord of Lords. And these Old Testament kings will teach us a lot about leadership, about the life of faith, about being a follower of the King, but also about the inadequacies and imperfections of these kings, even in the Bible, very deeply flawed. So they show us the need for a perfect king who can truly rule and reign over us, who we can really trust in, who'll never disappoint us. And there's only one person who fulfills that role. So this week, the overall title is God's People Divide. We saw last week a great high point in the history of Israel, the time of King David. And always, God's people from this point forward, they were looking back to that period as a sort of golden age. David defeated all their enemies. He brought peace. He gained control over all the land that God had promised to Abraham. He honored God and he saw that his people did the same. There was no doubting that in David's mind, there was no doubt, rather, in David's mind, that all he was able to do was only because of the Lord's faithfulness. That's the point. He is found to be a great king and a faithful servant, but it's all rooted in and flows from his relationship with his faithful Lord. Now, that's not to say that David was perfect, of course. There were many blots on his record, particularly the terrible event with Bathsheba, where he commits adultery with her. He's responsible for engineering the death of his very faithful servant, Bathsheba's husband Uriah. And the Bible, shows us that God doesn't have favorites. He honors those who honor him. And where there is a dishonor, there are consequences. As a result of David's adultery and the murder of Uriah, God promised him that there would be trouble in his family. The sword shall never depart, he said, from your family. His son Absalom led a rebellion against him and was accidentally killed. After Absalom's death, another son, Adonijah, tried to make himself king. David heard of all of this and publicly declared that Solomon would be king after him. And remember, there were some wonderful promises about Solomon, that he would continue the family line. He would build the temple. And he is David's wise son. That's the reputation he has, and we'll see why that is well deserved. And yet it is into this period now that the greatest catastrophe in the history of Israel will happen soon, and it'll happen largely as a result of Solomon. So we need to read two passages about him. First of all, 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 1 to 15. Solomon made an alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married his daughter. He brought her to the city of David until he finished building his palace and the temple of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. The people, however, were still sacrificing at the high places because a temple had not yet been built for the name of the Lord. Solomon showed his love for the Lord by walking according to the instructions given him by his father David, except that he offered sacrifices and burned incense on the high places. The king went to Gibeon to offer sacrifices, for that was the most important high place. And Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon during the night in a dream, and God said, "Ask for whatever you want me to give you." Solomon answered, "You've shown great kindness to your servant, my father David, because he was faithful to you and righteous and upright in heart. You've continued this great kindness to him and have given him a son to sit on his throne this very day. Now, Lord my God, you've made your servant king in place of my father David, but I am only a little child and do not know how to carry out my duties. Your servant is here among the people. You've chosen a great people, too numerous to count or number. So give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. For who is able to govern this great people of yours?" The Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for this. So God said to him, "Since you've asked for this, and not for long life or wealth for yourself, nor have asked for the death of your enemies, but for discernment in administering justice, I will do what you've asked. I will give you a wise and discerning heart, so that there will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be. Moreover, I will give you what you've not asked for, both wealth and honor, so that in your lifetime you will have no equal among kings. And if you walk in obedience to me and keep my decrees and commands, as David your father did, I will give you a long life." Then Solomon awoke, and he realized it had been a dream. He returned to Jerusalem, stood before the ark of the Lord's covenant, and sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. Then he gave a feast for all his court. And another reading in chapter 9, just a few chapters on, and verses 1 to 9. When Solomon had finished building the temple of the Lord and the royal palace, and had achieved all he had desired to do, the Lord appeared to him a second time, as he had appeared to him at Gibeon. The Lord said to him, "I've heard the prayer and plea you've made before me. I've consecrated this temple which you've built by putting my name there forever. My eyes and my heart will always be there. As for you, if you walk before me faithfully with integrity of heart and uprightness, as David your father did, and do all I command and observe my decrees and laws, I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever, as I promised David your father when I said, you shall never fail to have a successor on the throne of Israel. But if you or your descendants turn away from me and do not observe the commands and decrees I've given you, and go off to serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land I've given them, and will reject this temple I've consecrated for my name. Israel will then become a byword and an object of ridicule among all peoples. This temple will become a heap of rubble. All who pass by will be appalled and will scoff and say, why has the Lord done such a thing to this land and to this temple? People will answer, because they have forsaken the Lord their God, who brought their ancestors out of Egypt, and have embraced other gods, worshipping and serving them. That is why the Lord brought all this disaster on them. Amen. So two great passages about Solomon, two great events in his life when the Lord appeared to him. One of them was, the first one was in a dream. The second one, I think he's fully awake at the time. But how blessed this man is, how important he is in God's purposes, the son of David, the successor who will keep the family line going, the one who will build the temple of Jerusalem, the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem. Parts of that temple of Solomon are still there. The Wailing Wall is part of it in Jerusalem to this day. Many thousands of years later, and people still talk about having the wisdom of Solomon, don't they? Because indeed, he was the, as we've read here, he was the greatest of kings in his day and the wisest of men. And in the early days of his ministry or kingship. He had a proper sense of how overwhelming all of this was. This vast number of people, millions of them, the Israelites. He says, I'm only a little child and don't know how to carry out my duties, chapter 3 and verse 7. So when the Lord appears to him in a dream and says, what do you want me to give you? Ask for whatever you want me to give you. What does he say? I wonder what would we say? If the Lord appeared to you in a dream tonight and you had that blank check, what would you go for? We know what most people would go for. Oh, if only I could win the lottery. If only I could become first on Britain's Got Talent. Many young people today, and I'm not blaming them, it's just the culture they're brought up in. For the first time almost in history, young people who were asked, what do you want to be? I want to be famous. For what? Just famous for being famous. Celebrity. And so on. Well, there's nobody more famous, certainly that we're going to think about today, than King Solomon. You know, nearly 3,000 years later, we're still talking about him. And if you want celebrity and status and fame and power and all of that, he's your man. But he didn't want that. He didn't seek that. What did Solomon ask God to give him? Verse 9, so give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. That's what he wanted more than anything else. And God was pleased with that. I said earlier, that famous verse in Samuel, those that honor me, I will honor, God says. David had honored God, or he'd sought to. Yes, he had a tremendous collapse at a certain point, which in one sense he never quite got over. His family never quite got over that failure. But it doesn't mean that for most of his life, his heart was set in that direction. In fact, Solomon says this about his father. He was faithful to you and righteous and upright in heart. Yes, there were great failures, but that is the assessment of Solomon, his son, and of God himself concerning David. Later on, he says, and if you walk in obedience to me and keep my decrees and commands, as David your father did, I'll give you a long life. That's God's estimation. And that's how the Lord sees us in Christ. He sees his perfect divine righteousness, his accomplishment, his acceptability. He's made us acceptable. But he does want that to be reflected then in our attitudes, in our desires, in our petitions, and what we long for. So Solomon is not a worldly man at this stage. He's not lusting after material things. He's not longing just for power and for wealth and for honor and fame. Those are not the things that are his priority. And so the Lord honors him. He says, I will give you a wise and discerning heart, so that there will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be. Moreover, I will give you what you've not asked for, both wealth and honor, so that in your lifetime you will have no equal among kings. He also says, I'll give you a long life. It's interesting, isn't it? Solomon was not motivated by those things at this point. He didn't want them. In a dream, and this is interesting because the point of it happening in a dream, this conversation, is that the real person speaks who he really is, what he really wants in this sort of trance-like, dreamlike state. So the Lord knows he's done it this way because he knows that is really what he wants. But the Lord will honor him and bless him and give him those things that he doesn't want. He doesn't even need wealth, honor, a long life. But certainly under the terms of the Old Testament, these are symbols of prosperity and divine blessing, and they are appropriate for a king. But the great thing in 1 Kings chapter 3 is that Solomon's heart is revealed, seeking for wisdom. And that's what he got. And he became the wisest man in the world in his day. You've read some of his other sayings, haven't you, and writings. You've read, for example, some of the Proverbs, most of them written by Solomon. Ecclesiastes, that's him again. That's like his life story. The Song of Solomon, that's his passionate love affair with his beloved. Solomon has got a lot of material dedicated to him in the Old Testament, and we haven't even really gone into detail with 1 Kings and Chronicles. Tremendously important figure, Solomon. Into chapter 9, we see how Solomon ruled from Jerusalem. In verse 1, he built the temple of the Lord and the royal palace, and had achieved all he had desired to do. David was stopped from doing what he desired to do because there was blood on his hands. He was a warrior. But Solomon means, Solomon, it's similar to Shalom, king of peace. He's the man of peace. And during this period, Israel rules and has tremendous influence in the world at this time. People come like the Queen of Sheba from the ends of the earth to see him and to, just to pick up little tidbits of wisdom and wonderful things from his lips, what his insights, not only into the spiritual realm, but into the natural realm. We read that he was into botany, and, he was kind of like the David Attenborough of his day. He understood about nature, and so many things like that. We're told this in the Bible. And he achieved his two of his greatest ambitions, to build the temple for the Lord and a royal palace. So once he'd achieved all these great projects, the Lord appeared to him a second time, as he had appeared to him at Gibeon. So that's a reference back to chapter 3. God made an agreement with Solomon, just as he'd done with his father David. What did he promise to do? Chapter 9, verse 5. I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever, as I promised David your father when I said. So the family line, the house of David, the house of Solomon will be established. I'll establish your royal throne over Israel forever. And yet we will see in the course of this week that this family, this house, becomes divided against itself. And like our Lord said, how can a house divided against itself stand? And it won't stand. It will fall. It will break apart. It will end up in a kind of civil war and a total destruction of the kingdom. So how can that be fulfilled? I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever. You shall never fail to have a successor on the throne of Israel. That would have happened physically, materially, politically, if verse 4 had been fulfilled. As for you, if you walk before me faithfully with integrity of heart and uprightness, as David your father did, and do all I command and observe my decrees and laws, I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever. You see, it was a conditional thing. This is a covenant that God enters into with the family of David. It's been established many times. We can trace the line back to Moses and ultimately back to Abraham, this covenant. This is a new dimension, a new chapter, a new element now introduced into this covenant between God and the Israelites, Israel, the Jewish people, David, Solomon. But it's a conditional one. And we will see that Solomon will not fulfill those conditions, and everything will come crashing down. So that means God doesn't keep his word then. These promises are useless then, particularly if they're dependent on frail, fragile, sinful human beings. Yes, God will keep his word. He cannot break his promise. He will fulfill these promises to the house of David, but not in the way that this particular bit of the covenant would have pointed to a literal king, a literal throne, the temple, the palace, a political kingdom. None of that is going to happen. By the end of the Old Testament, even while Israel, some of the Jews are back in the land, it is a pathetic, pale imitation of the glory days of Solomon. Because what do? They do abandon him. And verses 6 and 7 tell us about that. But if you or your descendants turn away from me and do not observe the commands and decrees I've given you and go off to serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land I've given them and will reject this temple I've consecrated for my name, and so on. He's going to reject Israel. He's going to destroy this temple. Yes, he will do it. And he'll do it through the Assyrians and the Babylonians. These things which are facts of ancient history, the history that's going on all around us in the world today. God is at work. God is working through these things. We talk about a pandemic. We talk about the disastrous results of the election in America. So often we blame these things on Satan, and Satan is at work, of course, working and trying his best to destroy and to disrupt. But ultimately, God is in control. He ultimately is the King of Kings. He ultimately is on his throne. And yes, when these people who claim to be God's people, they were, in a sense, they were his covenant people, when they shattered the covenant, God, shattered them. They were wrenched away from the land. The wonderful temple is rejected and destroyed and brought to nothing, because God brings curses as well as blessings in this Old Testament covenant. And yet the promise, which is even bigger than this covenant, the promise to have a royal line, the promise to have a throne established to the house of David, a successor beyond Solomon, someone greater than Solomon. Those promises will be fulfilled, but in a very, very different way from what we would expect and anticipate if we only had these verses. And then if we only had the Old Testament, we'd think all those promises now have been destroyed. God doesn't keep his word. We have to wait thousands of years before great David's greatest son, great Solomon's greatest son, the most wise person who ever lived, and the greatest king who ever lived will come. You see why we're looking at it in this way? You see why the course is called Step by Step to the Coming King. Solomon was great, but we'll see tomorrow and in the coming days how he collapses, and the kingdom of Israel divides and is destroyed, and will never recover these glory days again. But there is another kind of glory, far greater, eternal, spiritual, the glory of grace, the glory of love. Where can we find that? Only in the King who is humble, only in the servant king. And when everything is destroyed and divided and hopeless and so on in this world, his kingdom remains true and faithful because he is. God bless you.